You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Bill, for the warm introduction. And thank you to our guests, our distinguished guest from the Parliament of Moldova, and of course, Ambassador Ursu. As Bill said, I'm Jorgan Andrews. I'm here with the Center for Russia and Europe. And it's our pleasure to have this, our first inaugural Moldova event for a new effort that we are undertaking on Moldova. I'd like to offer just a few brief remarks to set the stage for our panel discussion, and then I will introduce Ambassador Ursu to give some remarks off the top. And then after that, we'll have a conversation with our two distinguished guests, Mihai Popsoi, who's Deputy Speaker of the Parliament of Moldova, and of course, Ambassador Bill Hill, a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center, and a former U.S. diplomat who twice has served as the head of the OSCE mission in Moldova. Today's discussion on Russia's malign influence in Moldova is both important and extremely timely for a number of reasons. First, we all recall that one of Russia's aims when it launched its war in Ukraine was to establish a land corridor all the way across southern Ukraine and eventually to get to Transnistria in Moldova. Just a few days ago, on November 30th, I think most of us heard Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who said, and I quote, "Moldova is actually in the process of preparing to become the next victim of the hybrid war that the West has unleashed against Russia." If that's not a clear threat, I don't know what is. And then just yesterday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken hosted Romanian Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu here in Washington. And in his public remarks to the media before the meeting, Prime Minister Ciolacu urged Secretary Blinken to, quote, "take into consideration a special relationship with the Republic of Moldova. It's the most vulnerable country, the second most vulnerable country after Ukraine. And the Republic of Moldova is subjected to hybrid warfare directed against the president, Maia Sandu, and against democratically elected government." So let's think about that for a moment. The leader of a NATO ally and an EU member state used nearly half of his public remarks with the U.S. Secretary of State to urge that the United States maintain a special relationship with Moldova to help protect it from Russian malign influence. As I said before, today's discussion is both timely and important. In so many ways, Moldova's story is very inspiring. Here in America, we have a famous children's story called The Little Engine That Could. It's about a small but courageous and intrepid train engine who overcomes great obstacles to climb a big mountain and reach his goals. Moldova is a lot like that little engine that could. Since its independence, Moldova has faced daunting obstacles, including, to cite just a few examples, a 30-year frozen conflict in Transnistria, sparked by Russian-backed separatists, a Russia-fueled money laundering scheme that led to the theft of $1 billion, which at the time was a significant portion of Moldova's GDP, state capture for a period of time by a single oligarch and a legacy of undue influence by other oligarchs, the near-complete saturation of the information space by Russian media and propaganda institutions, near-complete energy dependence on Russia, and finally, Russia's heavy interference in Moldova's elections and governance through financial and other support to certain Moscow-friendly political parties, politicians, and oligarchs. But just like that little engine that could, Moldova seems determined to overcome these obstacles and reach its declared destination, which is full membership in the community of European democracies and free markets. And never before has Moldova's compass remained so fixed on its European future. Since President Sandu was inaugurated in 2021, her government has survived a Russia-backed plot to overthrow it, battled a flood of Russian disinformation and survived the public protests that resulted, has largely diversified its energy demand away from Russian sources, has accepted the highest per capita number of Ukrainian war refugees, and implemented reforms that were sufficient to earn a positive recommendation for opening EU accession talks. Clearly, Russia is working harder than ever to destabilize Moldova and divert it from its European trajectory. Now, perhaps more than ever, Moldova needs steadfast partners. In that spirit, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Viorel Ursu, Ambassador of the Republic of Moldova to the United States, to deliver remarks on Russia's malign influence and how the United States can further augment Moldova's efforts to build resilience. Ambassador Ursu is a dedicated transatlantic scholar and statesman. He has worked and studied in the United Kingdom, Belgium, Poland, Switzerland, France, Spain, and a little-known university here in the United States called Harvard. With 2 master's degrees in EU law, it's quite possible that the ambassador knows more about the EU than the EU itself. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you again for being here, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the Institute for Peace for organizing this event for us. I think it's probably it's not the first event on Moldova in this institution. I hope not the last one. As I said, when we were framing this conversation, it's just because of my background, as I used to work in Brussels on previous enlargement of the European Union. I'm a big believer in European Union as a peace project. I wanted to talk about Moldova's own trajectory now to the European Union, and I hope it's going to be a historical decision just in 10 days in Brussels, 15th of December, when we hope the EU leaders coming together will agree to opening the negotiations for accession for the Republic of Moldova. I think that's the highlight of our foreign policy, that's the focus of foreign policy, but also is the vision that the President Sandu had, and that would guide the transformation, modernization of Moldova for the next 7-10 years, and hopefully will become the member of the EU. However, when I came to DC a year ago, I had very different concerns, and one of the main 2 tasks that I had coming into this mission at that time, that was before we were getting into the winter last year, was I had 2 tasks. One is to make sure that the US, as much as the other partners in Europe, continue supporting Ukraine to defend itself, because it's also defending Moldova. We are the closest to the front line, and at that time, and even now, every morning, the first thing I do is opening the news, the Ukrainian news, watching the front line. And the second task was, again, is seeking the help of our partners, including from the US, on how we can mitigate the Russian hybrid attacks that already we were seeing were intensifying, especially over the last autumn. Just going back a year ago, I think the Russian plan that we know much more now about that was a very simple one, is weaponizing the energy. Moldova really had that vulnerability that we were 100% dependent on Russian supply of mostly gas, but also electricity which is produced from burning the Russian gas. And Russia never hesitated to use that leverage. Previously it used the trade embargo as a way to leverage, but that was really one of the most difficult to overcome, just because we use the Russian gas to heat our mostly private and public buildings. So I arrived in September. In October already Russia cut the gas supply by 30%, and then 1st of December they cut by another 50%. Moldova is not a big consumer of energy still. Between Transnistrian region and the rest of Moldova, we actually divided half and half of the consumption. So when Russia cut by 50%, we had a choice, the government had a choice, either to continue sharing that volume of gas, or it was actually a much bolder decision, I think, politically, that the government decided they're not going to buy any more of Russian gas, and all the supplies that continue would go only for the consumption of Transnistrian region. That meant that we really had to find solution, to find new supplies in a very short time. None of the governments in the 30 years of independence of Moldova actually ever addressed that issue of vulnerability. And just in few weeks at that time, I think Moldovan government, again, with the support of our partners, including the US, European partners as well, were able to secure a new supply of gas from Europe. Russian plan was easy. You cut the gas supply, which forces Moldova then to go to buy on European market. It just happened that it was 7 times more expensive because everybody was struggling to find new sources of gas. Because we have market economy, it means that the final consumers will have to pay their energy bills for heating at 7-fold increase. That created an inflation of 35% last year. And there was genuine people struggling, and there are more vulnerable population than ever that struggle even to pay the bills. As a result, we saw public protests, including on the street, against the government. Some of them, or most of them, probably were genuine because really people were struggling. And again, the Russian plan was to use that protest and to infiltrate some of the violent elements among the protests, well-trained abroad, that would infiltrate and then provoke violence, overreaction from the police. That was the plan from the spring, and I think that was, we found many of those details, by the way, on the round of US sanctions that were announced. The second round was announced last June against some of the Russian agents who were involved in training some of those protest elements. I want to say, without going into much details, that Russian plan failed. I think on again, what really helped us is that many of our partners, primarily European, but also the US, supported us from those difficult moments. I keep repeating that the friends in need are friends indeed, and we really saw who our real friends are, including from the US. It's unprecedented when the administration, but the Congress adopted a substantial support for Moldova, about 300 million just to secure our energy, to provide support for our energy security. Some of the money, including the European, helped us to compensate some of the costs, the rising costs for the most vulnerable consumers, but also help us to look into future and reshape our gas grid and also electricity grid, and to prepare us to be much more independent in our future energy production and supply. Russian failing on this scenario, of course, doesn't give up, and we see continuous efforts to try to change and to influence both politics but also the population in Moldova. And there are many ramifications of that. Most recently, we had elections, local elections. We saw a lot of illegal funding going to various new political projects in Moldova. Energy remains, again, another weapon that Russia tries to continue to use. Most recently, even in the elections, we saw some promises of cheap gas supply coming from a very untransparent offshore companies, most probably Russian sources, to very specific region that would vote for Russian candidates. And then most recently, again, trade embargo. Russia just last week introduced again trade export embargo on Moldovan fruits and vegetables, which many of our farmers still rely on. And of course, disinformation and misinformation, it's still very much of it is controlled by some of the Russian sources, which of course is a much difficult to overcome, especially for democracies, including Moldova, where you really have to balance on freedom of opinion expression, freedom of speech, and curtailing some of those disinformation sources that primary focuses on propagating hate, especially towards Ukraine. Also, I think this new reality is being also reflected in the updated national defense strategy, which was announced by President Sandu a month ago and is now in the Parliament. And I hope my colleague here, Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, Mihai Popsoi, can go into more details. So I really wanted to share those, which I hope, at least positive for me in 1 year, seeing how dire the situation was a year ago. And this winter, for instance, we're entering the winter, it's much confident, much better prepared, probably the best prepared into the winter. Because again, with the support from the US, Europeans, we were actually able to buy gas when it's cheaper in the summer. Cheaper than what would have be the price from Gazprom if they actually continued the contract. And for the first time, we actually have enough gas in our reserves to go through the winter, so even the fluctuation of prices wouldn't affect. So that required a really bold leadership. Of course, it was very risky, but as I said, what doesn't kill you make you stronger, and we always managed to get through some of those challenges and provocation by the Russia to become stronger. And I think this year we're definitely proved, again with the support of our partners in the US, Europeans, that we can overcome some of those challenges. Thank you.
So, Ambassador, thank you very much for those remarks. The explanation of the energy steps that Moldova has taken is really hopeful, and obviously energy was one of the main vectors of Russian malign influence. So, wow, that's a lot of progress in 1 year. But thank you for framing. I think it's perfect for this discussion that we'll be having. So, now I'd like to introduce a little bit our two distinguished guests, and then have a little bit of a discussion, and I will do my utmost to save some time at the end for audience questions. Mihai Popsoi is Deputy Speaker of the Moldovan Parliament and Vice President and International Secretary of the ruling Action and Solidarity Party of Moldova. As an expert in Moldova's political dynamics as well as regional security developments, he previously conducted research with a number of U.S. think tanks and institutions and worked for the NATO Center in Moldova. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for taking time to be with us today. Ambassador Bill Hill, in the far chair, is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. He's a retired Foreign Service officer, and Ambassador Hill was twice appointed as head of the OSCE mission to Moldova, where, as I understand it, according to his biography, he was, quote, charged with negotiation of a political settlement to the Transnistria conflict and facilitation of the withdrawal of Russian forces, arms, and ammunition from Moldova. Wow, that's a very ambitious mandate. Bill, I think I speak for all of us here and possibly for the entire country of Moldova when I say just how disappointed we are that you were unable to resolve the Transnistria conflict in 2 tries and escort the Russians out of Moldova. But I understand you're still working with Moldova and Moldovans, and so there's still hope yet. But thank you also for being here and sharing this time with us. Ambassador Hill, of course, remains one of the foremost U.S. experts on Moldova, both either inside or outside the government. And of course, esteemed former Foreign Service colleague and a good friend to both Moldova and this institute. So thanks again, Bill. And now I'll open with one question for each of our panel members to get the conversation started, and then we'll see where the conversation goes from there. And Speaker Popsoi, if I could begin with you, and again, welcome to USIP. Thank you for being here during your visit. My question is this. We're all waiting, hopefully, and dare I say expectantly, for the European Council decision next week on accession talks for Moldova and Ukraine. In fact, as I was mentioning backstage, I'm even wearing my EU tie as a good luck charm, hoping that the decision goes well. Mr. Speaker, what are some of the specific steps that Moldova is currently taking? We already talked about energy, but there are some other vectors for Russian malign influence not least of which democratic interference, disinformation, corruption, and even Transnistria. Perhaps speak to us a little bit about what other things Moldova is doing to try to make itself more resilient in the face of Russia's malign influence.
Thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity of presenting you some of the successes that Moldova has achieved in the past 2 years, and of course some of the challenges that still remain. When it comes to Russia's malign influence, as it was mentioned already, as we speak, Moldova is debating the new national security strategy, which will hopefully be approved this week. Well, it should be approved since we have an absolute majority in Parliament. It is a belated document in the sense that if you ask a proper security expert in Moldova, and even anyone who follows the difficulties that Moldova has had in the past decades, they would tell you which entity is the main national security threat to Moldova. Yet, to this day, this has not been reflected in Moldova's national strategic documents. It is only this week that we will be voting in a national security strategy of Moldova, spelling out that Russia is the main national security threat of Moldova, and not only spelling it out, but also taking actions in order to build resilience in our institutions with that particular threat in mind. Unfortunately, for far too long, Moldovan politicians have not only avoided this truth, but they've been actually actively engaging in promoting Russia's malign influence in Moldova, including and not limited to the propaganda, which some Moldovan politicians benefited directly from the broadcasting rights of Russian TV stations in Moldova. And, of course, the political parties that the Russians have been sponsoring to do their bidding. Now that we've established clearly, albeit a bit late, that Russia is the main national security threat, we will have to invest more resources. Again, something that we should have been doing all this 40 years, 30 years. But ironically, it was also the Russians that have been inoculating this idea into the Moldovan public that neutrality is a guarantee of security, which is, of course, cannot be further from the truth. No neutrality clause of any country has precluded an aggressor from taking advantage of the vulnerability of that country. But the fact that the Russians have promoted this idea that neutrality is a guarantee of security, now it's very difficult to have this discussion about alternatives to Moldova's security. But we are opening this discussion, and we are again spelling out in Moldova's national security document for the first time that we need to explore other avenues of ensuring Moldova's security, not just limiting ourselves to neutrality, and increasing our cooperation with NATO. As, again, you don't have to have a PhD in security studies to realize that for a country like Moldova, in the region that Moldova finds itself in, such an alliance as NATO is the only guarantee of proper security. But it will take time for us to debate this in the public domain and to democratically engage with our citizens so that we break through this spell of Russian propaganda, through this wall that has been built for 30 years, that neutrality is a guarantee of security. And to add insult to injury, it is the sheer fact that it was only Russia that was violating Moldova's neutrality for these 30 years, maintaining unwanted military presence in Moldova, and actually committing itself to withdrawing those military presence from under the 1999 OSCE summit in Istanbul, and failing to do so up to this day. So Moldova is clear in its stance now, and will continue to support Ukraine because we realize that the suffering and the sacrifice of Ukraine, it's not only for Ukraine's sake, it also to keep us safe as well. So we'll continue to provide our infrastructure and our support and our openness of our homes to our Ukrainian friends and neighbors. And we are very thankful to the international community for helping Ukraine, but also helping us in these very difficult times. When it comes to Russia exploiting our vulnerability, they are now moving towards exploiting the democratic process against our democratic future. They're trying to hijack our democratic elections in their favor. And that's why we had to take drastic measures to defend our democracy. by the Constitutional Court declaring unconstitutional that party offshore, the oligarch that is a fugitive from Moldovan justice, and will continue to defend Moldovan democracy. It doesn't give me any pleasure to be announcing that we had to implement measures that preclude certain political parties from participating in the democratic process. But then when these political parties have been actively engaging in corrupting our citizens, and we've seen that time and time again, including in the Gagauzia election in the autonomous region just lately. And even though I was sort of bragging at the beginning that we have 63% of seats in parliament and we have an absolute majority in parliament, there is no way how I can compete or any other political force in Moldova can compete against cash. I can tell Moldovan citizens that we are implementing robust reforms in combating corruption, in building rule of law, in strengthening Moldova's security, in embracing and implementing and defending human rights in Moldova. But if somebody is offering that same citizen 100 euros or $100 in cash, unfortunately 9 times out of 10, and I might be optimistic here, the people will take the money. And that's why we had to take measures. And thankfully, our international partners and our citizens, frankly, understand that difficult times require difficult measures to be taken. And we are thankful that the international community has supported us throughout this time to build our resilience in the energy sphere, in our defense sector. And I must commend our Minister of Defense, who have been so instrumental in doubling the Moldova's defense budget without necessarily using public resources. Just because of the openness and the generosity of our international partners, he managed to double the budget. But this year, we're also increasing the defense budget because we need to invest our fair share as well. And in this, again, national security strategy, we are committed to increasing Moldova's budget in the upcoming years to 1% of GDP. Not quite there with the 2% of the NATO standard, but then again, the majority of NATO members are not quite fulfilling that standard. For us, 1% is a big target, because we've always had about 0.3%, 0.4%. So we are making serious steps in defending and increasing the resilience of our institutions. And when it comes to the Transnistria region of Moldova, now that hopefully we will start negotiations with the EU, this should be the biggest breakthrough, the biggest opportunity also for the resolution of the conflict, of the peaceful resolution of the conflict. Because the business elite in the Transnistrian region, much like the rest of Moldova, they see the benefits of being part of such a big market, such a peaceful, rule of law driven market as the European Union. And I'm very hopeful that the start of the negotiations will create this impetus that will kickstart the process in a way that we unfortunately haven't seen for 30 years.
Speaker Popsoi, could we return maybe to the media environment? I know there have been legislative projects and steps taken to try to limit Russia's dominance, traditional dominance in Moldovan media. And given the size of the media market there, the model was not sufficient to generate a lot of new content from Moldova, and so Moldova was depending on Russia and elsewhere for free content, essentially. What steps has the Parliament taken? Where is that headed in Moldova?
As I mentioned, we've been in this very, very odd situation when some of Moldova's politicians who pretended to be pro-European were rebroadcasting Russian propaganda in Moldova, which was cannibalizing the advertisement market. Because you can imagine Russian federal TV channel with, 100 million or more euros for entertainment budget being put on the same legal footing to compete on the national Moldovan market with the Moldovan TV channel, which barely has a total budget of €1 million a year, if at all. That was an unlevel playing field. And with the start of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and frankly, even before that, we were concerned, but we were in opposition. But when the Russian aggression started, it took us a year, and I'm not at all happy that it took us so long. But we had to weigh all the pros and cons. We're concerned about what our citizens are going to react, what our international partners are going to say, because after all, we are the biggest promoters of freedom of media and freedom of speech in Moldova. And we didn't take this decision lightly. But then when December came, and it was a year into the Russian aggression in Ukraine, the European Union shut down Russian propaganda in the EU, Russia Today. And we figured if it's good for EU to take these measures, then it's about time that we take care of it as well. So we shut down Russian federal TV channels in Moldova. Again, very belated decision, but we addressed that. But it will take years for us to actually remedy the damage that has been done in these 30 years. And also we need to invest more in quality content in Russian language in Moldova, so that citizens who are Russian speakers have something to watch, be it entertainment or news, in the language that they understand, proper quality content. And we also have now a newly created institution, a strategic communication unit that we modeled after our friends from the Baltics, that will oversee the national media environment and social media to find and analyze and pinpoint where the narratives come from and where the attacks are coming to us, and that the other proper institutions, the national regulator and the audiovisual and the intelligence service, so they can take action in due time. And we've been proactive in defending our informational security. A bit late, but as they say, better late than never. And we're taking our information security a lot more serious. And again, we'll continue to invest in our security and information security. And we need to provide those alternatives to our citizens. And also in this national security strategy, that's also an important element in building resilience in our institutions, because we understand that when you live in a Russian propaganda bubble, when your citizens are left one-on-one with Russian propaganda, that is inviting and creating and increasing the fertility of that ground for the Russians to exploit. So we've addressed that, thankfully, but it will take time, as I mentioned, to remedy the damage that is done. And I have to thank American taxpayers and USAID for supporting independent media in Moldova, because without the support of the United States and European Union, it would not have been possible for those few independent media in Moldova to be able now to compete and to win against the Russian elements that they are trying to promote in Moldova.
Thank you very much. That's really useful, interesting perspective on how far things have come. But speaking of how far things have come, Ambassador Hill, if I could turn to you, help us with some perspective on how far Moldova has come in building its resilience against Russian malign influence. What, in your view, remains to be done? I'm thinking particularly in the Transnistria space and how much things have changed there over the years. And what can the U.S. and other friends of Moldova do to help Moldova as it builds up its resilience?
Well, thanks very much, first of all, for having me. And I guess I'll start out with, following the introduction, with a mea culpa. Indeed, I didn't get it solved. But I do, if there's one thing, did you accomplish anything in 2 terms as head of the OSCE mission? When I arrived in Moldova in June of 1999, there were over 500 Russian tanks, APCs, and mobile artillery, plus tons and tons, thousands of trucks and other pieces of Russian military equipment in the Transnistrian region, and 40,000 metric tons, that's metric tons, not pounds, of ammunition at Kolbasna. All of the tanks, APCs, mobile artillery, other military equipment, and half of the ammunition are gone. As Russian forces crossed the Dnipro through Kherson towards Mykolaiv, and the Ukrainians successfully resisted them, imagine what might have happened had there been a second front from out of Transnistria into Odessa Oblast with that military equipment. So it was 20 years later, but it turns out actually there was something to what we did there. We, for various other circumstances, we didn't get done everything we wished to, but this is emblematic of some of the changes 4 quick points in what's the same and what's changed. 2 things are really the same in Moldova. Is when the Soviet Union fell apart, or when I was first there, actually I was first there as detailed to the Department of Defense and OSD policy, and visiting Moldova in the mid-90s as a DoD official. The Russians still look at Moldova, just Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus is their Western perfect. It's basically, they recognize them as independent, but the Russians, certainly I get this out of personal dealings, they still consider that it's theirs. And it's not just Soviet, it's part of the Russian Empire. Bessarabia first was annexed by Russia in 1812. And this is an underlying attitude. Well, independence, okay, as long as you vote the same way we do everywhere, then you're perfectly independent to vote exactly as we tell you to. The other thing in Moldova is that Moldova is for a small country, it is linguistically and ethnically complex with a number of minorities. And in particular, Deputy Speaker Popsoi has referred to it, the extent of Russian language is broader than one might surmise if you just looked at the statistics for the last names of population, whether ethnic Romanian, Russian, Ukrainian, or whatever. And it's been an ongoing problem because culturally, the Russian-speaking population, for various reasons, has been prone to getting influence from Russia. And whether if it's some things, if it's reading Pushkin or watching the opera Boris Godunov, it seems relatively harmless. If it's other things, as a Russian media environment, and I lived in it, it was a Russian media environment because of the strength of the Russian media as opposed to the Romanian language. And that's been very hard to deal with, and it remains a problem, which means that the avenue for Russian influence has been very stubborn and persistent. What's changed? Well, the Russians used to, when I first came there, the Russians used to penetrate, get a lot of influence into Moldova through the Transnistrian region. 2014, 2015, that changed. As one of my senior Moldovan friends said, now Ukraine's on our side. And the Russians don't get into Moldova through Ukraine and Transnistria. And that's very important because it has led to a waning, not an absence, but a waning of the power of Russian influence through Transnistria. The other thing, over 30 years, Russia, or Transnistria, has changed in that overtly Russian staffed and run institutions have receded a bit, and local businesses and institutions that are run by locals have become more influential and more determinative in how Transnistria looks at things. It's not absolute. The Russians still have people there. They have influence there. The FSB in particular is very well represented. My estimation, probably a bigger danger right now than the uniformed Russian military who are there. But the Russians can't get to Moldova as much through Transnistria, so they've been trying to get to them through energy. I was working with the government when Kazakh came down in 2021, made it was really a nice offer to the Moldovans with a poison pill inside. And when Chisinau recognized the failings of the offer, the Russians immediately resorted to energy pressure. And the other thing they have done is the electoral influence. I can't do everything, but they have come, especially through the Shore Party, just over, trying to buy the electorate. And the risk to Moldova here, despite the progress that the current government has made, taking advantage of opportunity, moving really on the way, I hope. The vote of the council will be good, this month, and I presume it will be because the signs are there. But, Moldova clearly has done very well in moving towards eventual EU membership, and the candidacy process, has its difficulties. Every country that's been through it knows that. But I see success there. But politically, the government is still vulnerable to Russian political Russian interference in the political process because of this portion of the electorate through poverty and through linguistic orientation still remains vulnerable to the media propaganda, the political propaganda, and the simply buying of votes. I don't have time to go into what they're doing, but it really, it's something where thankfully it looks like militarily, thanks to what the Ukrainians have done, the Russians militarily are not going to get to Moldova. And thankfully, Moldova and Ukraine, the current governments seem very much on the same page, supportive of each other, proceeding together towards the EU. It's in Moldova, the Russians get there through an oligarch in refuge in Israel. And this is the big danger now, is that local elections just occurred. The results were mixed, inconclusive, I would say. PAS didn't do as well as you wanted to. It was not by no means a failure, but it's clear that the political battles for the presidency in 2024 and the parliamentary elections, which must come by mid-2025, are going to require serious effort. And I think my friend, Mr. Popsoi, has outlined the real problem is, how do you deal with a political force that has strength in the country but does not accept the rules of the game, does not accept basic democratic procedures, principles, in other words, is not going to play fair and is dedicated to restoring Russian influence and thwarting what seems to be a desire of a clear majority of the Moldovan population. So that is what I see. Things have changed in the sense of how the Russians have been coming at Moldova and seeking to keep Moldova in their orbit. But the basic problem really hasn't changed that much in 30 years. It's more acute now because of the war next door. But it's not a dissimilar problem to what I first witnessed when I came there in the mid-1990s.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Bill. We put a lot out there on the table. We've talked about most of the major vectors of Russia's malign influence in Moldova. I think this would be a great opportunity now. We have a very Moldova-supportive, Moldova-friendly audience. We've got some real expertise in the audience. So I would like to open the floor to audience members who would like to ask questions. And we have a microphone back here. Ellie, I think we have someone up here. Oh, yeah, and there's Kirtika. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Anna Sineva. I'm here in a private capacity, but I work for a religious organization, and I'm a member of a religious minority that is currently under heavy crackdown in Russia, like pretty much any religious minority. I'm from Russia. I'm a U.S. citizen right now. And I'm wondering, I have a question for Mr. Deputy Speaker. In your policies and in your plan in hopefully joining the EU, what is your strategy on supporting civil society and particularly freedom of religion or belief? Because Russian government and the Russian Orthodox Church infamously have been for decades bringing forward a strategy both inside the country and in the neighboring countries to divide and conquer, to stigmatize minorities of any kind, and with the objective of getting governments in other countries to crack down on any elements that aren't welcome in Russia either. So to crack down on any civil society, journalists, NGOs, religious minorities. And I think they've been very successful in a lot of countries. So just wondering if you're aware of the strategy and what your plan is.
Well, I must say that I'm incredibly proud of our record when it comes to supporting and promoting minorities in Moldova, all minorities. We have in our faction in parliament ethnic minorities, linguistic minorities, religious minorities, and we are proud of the diversity that we represent within our faction in parliament, because in our effort to transform Moldova, we need to make use of every single citizen's capacity to participate. I am very proud to say that in the Republic of Moldova we have one of the best records in women empowerment. We have 40% of women in parliament. thanks to the double quota that we implemented. And I have a suspicion that in the next election, our list is going to be 50-50. And in this respect, we try to be what Russia is not. We are trying to be as European as we can be, and we are trying to be as welcoming and accommodating to all our citizens, no matter the differences that we have. That has been a big credo and is a big credo of our president, Maia Sandu, and a big expectation of our citizens. So we are incredibly open and we are incredibly supportive of civil society. This year we're going to implement a fund to support also media in Moldova, civil society, and they are a reliable partner for us in our European aspirations. So we are as open as we can be. Of course, we can do better, and we will do better.
Thank you for that question. Let's go up here. Ambassador.
Thank you. I'm Pamela Smith, and I was U.S. Ambassador to Moldova some 20 years ago, but it seems like yesterday in some ways. It's wonderful to see so many people so interested in this wonderful country. I was fascinated, Deputy Speaker, when you talked about the evolving attitude toward NATO in Moldova. When I was there, neutrality seemed like perhaps a way to keep Russia at bay. Maybe that's what Russians wanted Moldovans to think. But anyway, could you speak more, please, about the kind of relationship you foresee or wish to acquire with NATO? Thanks.
You're totally right. In the 1994 Constitution, the neutrality clause was put there in the hope, which is not a good strategy, but nonetheless in the hope of shaming Russia in withdrawing its troops and munitions from the Republic of Moldova. The clause of neutrality was put there in 1994, it is still there, and the Russian troops are also there. So that didn't help. That was the primary idea behind neutrality clause. There wasn't much of an evolution in our perception of neutrality in the 30 years. And when I was working for the NATO Center in Chisinau 2008, 2009, 2010, I was hoping that there could be a change. And when in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, there was an uptick in NATO support in Moldova. It went from about traditional 25% and went to about 35%. And then, in a couple of years, it went back down to the traditional 25%. And it was a shame because it was clear what the main threat in the region is, and it was also clear what the main avenue to mitigate that threat is. But because of Russian propaganda, and quite frankly, because of the political elites in Moldova were not proactive enough in advocating for NATO and discussing the alternatives to ensuring Moldova's security, we are stuck with the reality that we find ourselves in. We now try to mitigate some of the damage, and we are much more open in discussing the alternatives to neutrality, but it needs to be a democratic process. We cannot impose a change of Moldova's security stance. We need to persuade our voters that a democratic change and our closer relations with NATO are the proper way forward, and we are committed to doing just that.
Thank you. Another one back here.
Thank you. My name is Matthew Murray, and I wanted to ask the Deputy Speaker if he could talk about what you've done to defend the banking sector, the finance sector, to create resiliency within, the financial world to resist Russian money laundering, to resist the use of conflict loans, both of which were at the root of the prior financial crises in the country. So where do you feel Moldova stands on building up the resiliency of the finance sector, including through the central bank, and the role of the parliament in that? Thank you.
We have come a very long way from the banking fraud, when 12% of GDP were siphoned off, and Moldovan taxpayers ended up footing that bill and will continue to pay for that hole in the budget for years to come. But the banking sector has become a lot more resilient. And I'm reminded every day when I go to the bank about that resilience. Because as a politician, as a politically exposed person, I have to provide all kinds of paperwork to the bank every time for like 100 euros or 500 euros or whatnot, any transaction. But I'm reminded of why that is in place. And I'm, of course, frustrated by the paperwork, but I am also very unhappy that that was not in place when the fraud actually happened. Because if everything was in place and all those mechanisms were in place, then Moldovan taxpayers would not be left hanging with that incredible burden for years to come to be paid. But now the banking sector and the central bank and all the private banks have implemented robust measures that the threat of the banking sector being used against the Republic of Moldova is a lot lower. And the banking sector now, we are looking at, in our effort to de-oligarchization, it's a tough word, to reduce the influence of oligarchs in Moldova, the banking sector has an important role to play. And given that all of our oligarchs are now fugitives and are outside the country, the fact that the banking sector has all those mechanisms in place to keep them at bay and not allow them to use the banking sector to increase their malign influence or the Russian influence, I'm confident that the measures that have been put in place will keep those nefarious influences at bay. Unfortunately, what is a lot more difficult to mitigate is the cash. The money mules that the Russians have been using now in elections. We have the 10K limit, which is like everywhere else, and we cannot sort of address that because then we would hurt a lot of law-abiding citizens. But they were exploiting and using money mules to carry cash into the country to buy those votes in elections. So we're trying to mitigate that at the exchange office. It's a mixed result so far, but that's part of the bigger societal effort and the bigger reform that we're implementing in the justice sector and the anti-corruption center so that we can mitigate some of those avenues. But in terms of the banking sector, I'm confident, knock on wood, that we'll never be in a position that we were 10 years ago, where we ended up being known as, you know, the country that allowed itself to 12% of GDP being stolen. That's not a tagline that I want to see for my country.
I have enough questions for the next 4 hours, but I'm mindful of the time. We have just a few minutes left, and this side of the room has been hogging all the questions. I want to give this side of the room a chance. If there are questions, sir, you want to?
Good afternoon.
Oh, Ellie's coming with the microphone.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Poparadu, in a National Army of Republic of Moldova officer. Currently, I'm a student at the National Defense University here in Washington, D.C., doing my master's degree in strategic studies. And one of my paper actually is Russian influence in Moldova. So I will take this advantage to ask again, Mr. Hill, a question regarding Moldova and Russian influence. So in your opinion, what is Russian center of gravity in Moldova, and what are the critical vulnerabilities that can we target in order to make this center of gravity to fall apart? Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I instructed a couple of your predecessors when I was on the faculty of the National War College. The center, I think you can deduce from what I said, the center of gravity of Russian influence right now is the Moldovan public. Is what they need to do is to manipulate enough of the electorate so as to be able to take control or participate in control of one or more important institutions in Moldova. In Moldova, clearly, that's going to be the parliament. They were successful in electing a Bashkan in Gagauzia, but fortunately that influence can be limited and has already had a reaction locally as well as on the national level. But there is a real risk in the electorate because historically the electorate has gone back and forth between center-right, center-left governments, and it's been shown that some of the center-left governments have been overtly or moderately pro-Russian or subject to Russian influence. And I think that's what the what Moscow is trying to do now, both covertly and overtly. And the government is engaged in a number of measures already that Mr. Popsoi has mentioned. There are others that will have to be done, identifying covert operators, the money mules, many other things of trying to sneak people into Moldova, and what they do overtly through media, through disinformation, and in simply buying votes. The Shore Party has special stores where people go and get to buy stuff at a discount and other stuff as long as they vote the correct way in the Orhe region, one of the regions, and try to expand that. In any case, the politics, ironically, is now really because Transnistria has transformed a bit. Moldova has dealt relatively successfully with the energy problem, and it's now central is the political challenge that is posed by this interference. That's my perception, and that I think over the next year or so is going to be the most important fight for those who wish to keep Moldova on its present course.
Thank you. So I think we can do one more quick question, and then I'm going to give Deputy Speaker Popsoi the opportunity to give us a last word. I think there was one more on this side. No? Let's go back over here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Zvia Dadzimir from Georgia, currently at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, PhD candidate. I have a question about the topic of disinformation in Moldova. You, Deputy Speaker, you address some aspects of it. Could you let us know what are some of the critical, outstanding areas as it relates to Russian disinformation in Moldova, where experts and Western allies could help more and expedite the process, hopefully?
Well, as I mentioned, the institution that we are building now, headed by our former Minister of Interior, Anna Revenko, the Strategic Communication Unit, we hope that with the help of our international partners, we'll be able to provide enough capacity to this institution to be indeed the bulwark against the Russian influence online and offline, and so that the other institutions can take actions. But also we need to be more proactive at the societal level. We need to educate the citizens so that they can understand what are the threats towards Moldova's security. Because now, having lived in the Russian propaganda bubble, sometimes you find the situations that are really heartbreaking and painful to take when you have a citizen who is denying the fact and the horror of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, while in the neighboring house you have Ukrainian refugees living. So when you have this sort of reality and this sort of pernicious Russian propaganda, it will take a long time for us to be able to break through. But that's where we need to invest a lot more. That's where I mentioned that we're now channeling our resources, and hopefully we'll be successful in creating in a public broadcaster channel that is in Russian language, that will provide quality content, that we try to win over some of those citizens who have been living in this Russian propaganda bubble. But there is a lot more to be done also in the political realm. The Russians have been using political parties to advocate their agenda. But this is an effort that we need to mitigate together as a society. And I'm confident that with the support of our international partners and on the way to our European accession, we'll be able to address the challenge.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and fantastic haircut, by the way. The Deputy Speaker's comments actually are a good reminder that Moldova is not alone in dealing with Russian malign influence. Dare I say it, even here in the United States, we have at times had our challenges in detecting and resisting Russia's malign influence. And so one of the takeaways I hope from this session is that there's even more that we can be doing with other countries that are victims of Russia's malign influence to share experiences, share best practices, share techniques, share technologies, basically anything that can help our societies resist the messaging, resist the influence, resist the corruption, resist all of the ways in which Russia tries to penetrate and to gain influence in our societies. And so, with that, any last words, Mr. Deputy Speaker?
I just want to mention that after 30 years of dealing with this luggage without a handle, the community of independent states, which isn't much of a community and not a lot of independence being allowed to these members, we are exiting now, and we've been voting by the dozens, all kinds of multilateral agreements that we had in the CIS. And Moldova is taking ownership of its independence, of its sovereignty, and we are thankful for our international partners for supporting us in these challenging times. Moldova wants to be something that it was denied. It wants to be a proper European state, to return to the European family of nations, so that in Moldova people can live in peace comfortably, pray to whoever they want to pray, love whoever they want to love, vote for whoever they want to vote. And we're committed to providing all those rights and freedoms to our citizens. And thanks to the generous support of our partners in the European Union and in the transatlantic community, I'm confident that we can mitigate the challenges that our societies are facing. And we'll continue to stand with Ukraine, and we count on all of our international partners in doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you'll all help me in thanking Deputy Speaker Popsoi and Ambassador Hill for this interesting session.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.